Good evening, everybody. My name is Matthew Ogden. I'm an editor with LaRouchePack.com. I would like to thank all of you for joining us tonight with our first webcast of the year 2013. This is our regular Friday evening broadcast, and today is January 4th. Mr. LaRouche will be delivering opening remarks tonight as according to our usual format, and then following that we will be having questions posed by Jason Ross and Dennis Mason, who are both joining us here in the studio tonight. So I thank you all for joining us again, and I'm proud to give to you Mr. Lyndon LaRouche.
Well, there's some things that have to be dealt with under these circumstances. And we have a certain amount of cooperative spirit among the members of Congress who have been, and others who've been congregated in this process. And now the time has come to be more helpful to them, now that many of them are trying to do something about these problems, and give some helpful hints, shall we say, as to what they should take into consideration. For example, we had a report in the Washington Post on a fraud perpetrated against the people of Greece recently, and in the sense of really starving them to death, by a fraud perpetrated by the European Union. This particular case, first of all, it was willful fraud. Maybe not on the part of everybody involved, but certainly the leading circles, because they knew what was going on. What they were doing was very simply is this. They were going, Bernanke style, into hyperinflation. Now, what does hyperinflation mean? It means that you're issuing money and without production. Therefore, what's happening is you're taking the income of people, and the income that they're receiving in the same dollar amounts is plummeting at an accelerating rate. And this is what is happening inside the United States. It's happening willfully in Europe, because people say, oh, we're surprised. But people are ordinarily competent recognize that this is a fraud. What's going on in the European Union is a complete fraud, and it involves the systematic and increasing rates of murder of Greek citizens, who were the victims of the fact that the hyperinflationary program, which is driven by both sides of the Atlantic, whether in the European Union or in the United States itself, what we're doing is we are cheapening the value of labor so that when people are getting the same amount of a currency in money, they're actually getting less all the time, because the extra money that's being printed has no content whatsoever. It's purely hyperinflationary game money, boardwalk money. And this is the character of the thing. The worst part about it is that the programs that are being pushed by people who don't think clearly on these matters is that money has no intrinsic value. That is, there's only one form of money that has intrinsic value: gold and silver, when used as that, because it's a fixed amount. It's something that can be used interchangeably with money, and therefore it has some. But but if you limit yourself to the money available, even if it's good money, shall we say, in terms of gold and silver and the like, that doesn't solve your problem. Because the problem is that you've got to, you cannot use money, such as gold and silver, cannot drive growth in the economy. What drives growth in the economy is the use of the equivalent of paper money. And gold and silver as currency are simply a part of the whole process, because they have an intrinsic value. Gold and silver and currency in that form does have some kind of use, because you can always convert it into its use as a metal. Now, paper does not have much value and cannot be used in place of a metal. So what's the value of paper then? Well, the value of paper is what it represents as a commitment to credit. In other words, it's only the value committed to credit, which has any redeemable value. Now, most of that value is not just exchange. Most of that value has to be credit. That is, you are actually investing in increasing the productive powers of labor into the future. So when you issue credit in general, in terms of the general function of an economy, you have to be increasing your productivity in physical terms. And you use a currency like gold or silver as simply as a way of having some constant value that you reference to. And then you run the money system accordingly. But the actual gold and silver exchange is a tiny proportion, relatively, of the total amount of credit which is supported with the inclusion of that medium. In other words, that you're taking one, trying to fix something, and you're fixing a currency, for example, with gold and silver, or copper. You're using that simply as a way of setting a standard of comparison. Now, what you want, though, is you want to create credit, but that means you have to have credit. Generally, you can't go too far unless you are producing something. And you won't get far either unless you are increasing your productivity in terms of the kind of things you're producing, the productivity of the process, in terms of physical terms of work, in terms of the standard of living, in terms of physical terms of increase of the standard of living. So most people who study these matters in universities and schools and so forth, or accounting school, simply don't know what they're doing. Many accountants simply have no competence in economy because of the approach they're taking is an assumption which is not real. It doesn't correspond to reality. So therefore, we have a lot of problems. First of all, one thing that has to be made clear, that you're not going to have any recovery of the United States. You're going to have a collapse in very short order because the entire transatlantic region in particular, that is Europe and North America, are on the verge of blowing into hyperinflation. And if Bernanke is not checked and not fired, or if everybody likes him and is not fired, we're going to go into hyperinflation in the United States, and you're going to find something like has been done in Greece, where you actually have mass murder is being perpetrated by the European Union in terms of Greece in particular. And this article was reported today in the Washington Post, which is a very unusually for the Washington Post, is quite competent. And therefore it does represent something which people should pay attention to. So therefore the purpose is to increase the physical productivity per capita and per square kilometer of territory of mankind. If you're not doing that, now there's another reference here. Take the question of life in general, all forms of life. Well, let's keep out of the water for the time being. Let's stick to landed forms of life. The two, they're somewhat different trends. But the general tendency in life is to increase the energy flux density of the species. In other words, the evolution of life, the normal healthy evolution of life, is based on increasing the energy flux density of each member of a species, and of evolving from inferior species to higher quality species, more powerful, more productive. And this also applies to nations. The object is you have to increase the energy flux density per capita and per unit of life in general. That is, in terms of technology. You have to go to higher and higher levels of technology constantly, just as living processes die out. Why? Because they remain inferior, relatively inferior. Higher forms of life emerge, higher energy flux density, and the equivalent in terms of performance. And these species will tend to live. Those which laid in the old way of fashioned way were going to die out. And that same humanity, however, is not an animal. We have animal bodies, but our behavior is not that of an animal. And therefore, humanity has an indefinite capability of expanding its productivity as no other living species known on this universe to us can do. And therefore the function of mankind is not to be that of an animal, not to be that of a cow, a pig, etc., but to be a creative personality which no other species of life has ever achieved, except by biological evolution and favorable conditions of that biological evolution. So now the problem we have now is the green policy is killing us. Because what's happening with the combination of the green policy and hyperinflation, which is what we're getting into now, the value of life, the value of itself, is being cheapened. We are actually coming to the approach where the Queen's policy, the Queen of England's policy, of reducing the world population from 7 billion people to approximately 1, which is her target. It makes sense. What will do that? If you continue to have an environmentalist movement, run it the way it's run now, you are going to quickly reduce the potential population density of the planet, human population density of the planet, down to about 1 billion from 7. That was the greatest holocaust that's ever been conceived against mankind. And the so-called environmentalist program, as it's being now, is the greatest threat to the existence of humanity that could ever exist. Because it's a built-in threat, which mankind built into itself. So we now got to the point we've got to solve these problems. And there's no reason we shouldn't be able to solve these problems. They're well understood by me and some other people in the world. What you need is higher energy flux density. Because, for example, you want to get to Mars, you need thermonuclear fusion. Thermonuclear fusion in order to be able to do it. If you want to go by mankind, don't take the slow boat to Mars. You won't make it. You might make it in one case or two, but you're not going to make it often. But thermonuclear fusion, controlled thermonuclear fusion, is the only means by which we could say, in 30 days, get from the moon to Mars. Well, first of all, to get from the moon to Mars, you've got to get to the moon. And that means you've got to have a base on the moon, which is a productive base for giving you the product of technology which is needed on the moon in order to build up the system which is going to carry you to Mars. But if you get to that point, now you can probably have in 30 days a fair chance on a good season, a good part of the cycle of the Mars-Earth cycle. You might get a good chance of getting there within 30 days. If you start to think about longer than 30 days, you're getting into trouble. And therefore we can do a lot of things with non-living processes, especially non-mankind processes. But what we can do with man is if we have the technology developed on Earth, we can do as we have been doing gradually as long as NASA existed, and even after that now. We can build up systems on Earth and with the moon. Probably moon will be a great help in this process. It's much cheaper and much quicker to go from the moon to Mars than it is from Earth to Mars. So we can progress with a lot of instruments which go beyond what curiosity represents. We can build those instruments. We can plant them on Mars. We can actually, by using, we don't talk to people on Mars. Their machines up there don't talk. They communicate nonetheless. They communicate in electronic modes. And we can use those systems, which are sort of automated systems or quasi-automatic systems. We can use those systems to build up scanning from Mars as from Earth to Mars. We won't talk. We won't use human speech. We will use electronics. And we will create a system where we're going to try and have to find ways of dealing with this mass of threatening creatures out there. And we can do it by building a bridge of mutual function between Earth and Mars, including the moon. And most of this will be purely, shall we say, electronic. But we will control the process. We will translate what needs to be translated the way we have to. This designing of systems. We will design the systems which will enable us to extend man's brain, man's mind, into whatever task is needed to be done. And that should be our perspective. Now, to do that means we've got to increase the energy flux density per capita of mankind now greatly. If we do not do that, for example, we will not be able to defend Earth against asteroids. And if a big one comes by, it may be goodbye. So therefore, these measures and this change in policy has to occur. It has to occur on Earth also for many reasons. The greatest problem we have on Earth is the poor development of the conditions under which human beings live. We can solve that by increasing the energy flux density, as it's called. Everything in scientific work in terms of economy depends upon the concept of energy flux density. In other words, the greater intensity. We want to get to matter-antimatter reactions sooner or later. We want this higher density of capability. And what we're using is not the physical muscle of man. That plays a minor role, although, albeit lifting your finger even requires something. Huh? But it's because we can build systems of higher energy flux density. And only by doing that can we increase mankind's capability of dealing with the universe around us. And that's what we have to do. Now, the other side of that is goes right now. Here we have a situation where the Congress is being assembled again, hopefully no longer disassembled, or something should be disassembled, but not that in general. But we're going to have to increase the energy flux density of everything. Transportation, everything. Well, why not? That is our natural tendency as mankind. And therefore, we have to work out a system to do that. Now, the first step is to have an economic system, like a national economic system, a global economic system. And we have to build in the increase of energy flux density for all applications. In other words, what we're trying to do to compensate for man's lack of slowness in increasing his productivity, we can increase the productivity of the devices we design. And therefore we can translate that increase in power of mankind per capita, we can translate that into an improvement in the economy. So what we need to do is involve something else. What we have out there right now, if we do not do exactly what I have proposed we must do now, well, then this world, the nation especially, is going to go into a hyperinflation which will cause a high rate of mass deaths inside the United States soon. We see a warning of this in Greece. What happened in Greece? We see a warning of this in Spain, in Portugal, and elsewhere. It's coming on. So the Queen's desire to reduce the human population of this planet from 7 billion people to 1 is being realized now through the great help of people who insist on being stupid. All we have to do is use our ability to progress with scientific technologies. And in that case, we can meet these challenges. But the danger now is this. What we have is a hyperinflation. Now, what do you mean by hyperinflation? It means that the more debt you have, the more money you've printed, which is as debt. In other words, paper money goes out as debt. And you're increasing the debt without the means to repay. And therefore the result is simply, since you're not increasing the value of the debt, you are therefore driving down the actual standard of living, standard of productivity, and everything else of the nation as a whole. So not shutting down, that is, not using Glass-Steagall first. Now, first on the list, everything else is secondary. Put it to one side, everything else. Because it only takes a couple of steps to get the thing in place, and then you can start to deal with the other things. But first you must stop this hyperinflation. You have to eliminate it. And therefore we have to immediately go to Glass-Steagall. And as I've said before, Glass-Steagall by itself will not work. What Glass-Steagall does is stops, prevents some evil from spreading. And you want to stop that evil because there's no sense struggling unless you're going to do it. But once you decide to stop that evil, then what do you go to? Well, you go to production. You go to improve production, increase employment, and so forth. And cancel, and just simply cancel, all gambling debts. Because the greatest amount of hyperinflation in the United States, as in Europe today, is essentially in the form of worthless gambling debts being pumped out at an accelerating rate, as in Europe today. We're right at the point now. The hyperinflation is already in progress. It's in progress in Europe. It's already in progress in the United States. If you don't, first of all, stop this hyperinflation, which means shutting down Bernanke. This guy's got to be shut down. He's a menace to humanity. He's a menace to the human species. Shut him down. Foreclose him. We can reorganize the institution and get rid of that garbage. But the first thing we have to do is that. First, Glass-Steagall. That will get rid of a lot of problems, including speculation, financial speculation. It's gambling. The United States government must not and will not pay gambling debts of anybody, even itself. So get rid of the gambling debts. And now let's get into production. Let's start to employ people in production. And let's stop this cheapening of the value of labor, because every inch of inflation is many inches of losses of the standard of life. And these are the things, among the things, that only a few leading points I'm putting here down, on which we must proceed immediately. Glass-Steagall first, adopt it. What that does, gets rid of all the garbage, all the high financial gambling garbage, just gone. There's nobody's going to pay it. If they can't pay it for themselves, if they can't reform themselves and pay it off that way, too bad. We've got to save the nation, and we've got to save the world. And the United States is key to saving the world. We may have many faults, but we still have a United States with its Constitution. And that United States, with its Constitution, is one of the most important assets of humanity in the world today. We've got to keep that going. We've got to make the progress. And that's where we have to go now. That means we're going to have a credit system, which means we're going to give credit not over the barrelhead. Now, credit's contingent. Debt is contingent. You want this? You want to build this? Okay, we're for it. But you're going to have to repay in the future, not the present. You're not going to cash in on the present. You're going to incur a debt, which you're going to carry. You're going to support. You're going to be ingenious in fixing it when it needs fixing. And then you'll have a term of life where this debt will be paid off. How will it be paid off? Because you will plan to have it paid off. You will make the improvements and the actions which enable you to pay it off. You're going to figure out how many, and with the agreement of government, which is going to be supervising this thing, that we can do that. We can meet that debt in, say, 5 years, 10 years, 15 years, or say, NWAPA, 25 years. And that we can do. That's how a credit system works. It's something that you plan to do, which is going to pay off in the time that you specify for it, if you competently estimate how that can work. And that's where we want to go. So therefore we do that. Now we're going to have to do one other thing. If we create a credit system under which the availability of credit is provided through the government, through government control, and also this will include a private debt created in concert with the government, but as private debt. And we'll collaborate among these institutions in order to keep the economy growing. That's where we go. That's where we have to go. We can get there. I know a good deal about this, obviously. I've been at it for a long time, and therefore it stands there. But that's where we have to go. The first thing we have to do is we have to get a three-phase reform. Glass-Steagall, number one, because without Glass-Steagall you can't do anything else. It may not do much for you, except it'll save your head, your butt. It'll save your head and your life. Once you have that, now you are going to have to use on a credit system, just as John Quincy Adams did. The same thing. The same thing that was going on until it was shut down by Jackson, who was only a fool in this case. It was actually British interests who controlled Andrew Jackson and who raped the United States and bankrupted the U.S. economy. But we're going to not do that. We're going to get this thing going. And now once we set up the credit system to go with Glass-Steagall, and without a credit system, Glass-Steagall cannot do much, except save your butt, which may be of some value to you. But then we also have to have advances in technology on which investment is based. And that's where we have to go. Those three things are the first thing we have to do. Everything else, it comes afterward in priority, except the emergency for people living and things like that. But in general, those three measures, which are the triad of productivity, must be installed first. Once we have that in place, then we're able to incorporate other things that have to be done. So you want this done on Friday, on Saturday, Sunday, or Monday. Don't take too long. Get this done within less than a week, if you can. And you got to think in those terms. Because if you don't do it, what's coming down on you is an explosion of hyperinflation. And Bernanke is the guy who will do it. Bernanke can unleash, as it's being done in Europe today, Bernanke's foolishness, if it's allowed to continue, can blow this economy open, and there will be never any recovery. So that's what we've got to think about.
Thank you. If you're just tuning in, you're watching a live webcast with Mr. Lyndon LaRouche. Now, two things I'd like to just say quickly. Number one, there was an announcement, a public omission, a mea culpa, you could say, by the IMF chief economist, Oliver Blanchard, publicly admitting that he was incompetent when it came to economic forecasting, saying, I'm very sorry, but I did not fully understand how austerity would undermine the economic growth of Greece and the rest of the countries in Europe. Now, also, just in terms of what you just addressed, in fact, yes, the new 113th Congress is now reassembled. This last week actually saw the unprecedented continuation of the 112th Congress into the new year, through New Year's Eve and into the beginning of 2013. As soon as they left, the 113th Congress assembled, and the LaRouche PAC was in Washington in force yesterday and had a very substantial impact on this new Congress. And the support for Glass-Steagall is unprecedented, including among several freshman senators. So obviously everything that Mr. LaRouche is saying tonight has to be seen in that political light. Now, with that said, I'd like to ask Jason to come to the podium and pose a question regarding this subject.
Thanks. Well, yeah, this is the first part of the platform, as you were discussing, was Glass-Steagall. So there is a major push for Glass-Steagall again in the new Congress. As Matt had mentioned, there are a number of freshman senators, congressmen who have already come out in support of Glass-Steagall. Marcy Kaptur's Bill 1489 from the previous Congress has been reintroduced already as H.R. 129 in the 113th Congress. And the discussions that we had yesterday and earlier in the week indicate there's a lot of openness for this. However, it's also good to remember that we had almost 90 co-sponsors. There were almost 90 co-sponsors to Marcy Kaptur's 1489 in the last Congress, and it wasn't passed. So having a lot of support in terms of the number of people who are in favor of something or who would vote yes on it if it came to that isn't a measure of what will actually occur and what will actually get done. Now, Mr. LaRouche, you've been speaking recently about the need to identify a leadership group within the population. You estimated it as somewhere around 5% of the general population. It might be somewhat larger in the Congress, one would hope so. But what could you say about, I guess, two things? One is the role of a leader, including a member of Congress, in making this happen as a, as a personal thing they're pushing, as opposed to gradually getting there. And what are going to be the consequences of getting Glass-Steagall passed? What will that mean for us?
Okay. Well, the first thing you have to do, which is my special principle, you start from the future and work backwards. That's the only way to do anything competently. And the problem is people will say, well, try to work their way from today to the future. That's a mistake. You have to work backwards from the future. Now, of course, that's been my practice in business matters and relevant matters since the 1950s, when I was first in the forecasting business. And it worked then, and it still works. The principle always works. Human beings, unlike animals, start from the future. Now, I admit an egg does tend to grow. It does tend to hatch. But the point is, it also happens in the future. The hatching comes in the future. So the point is, you have to start from the future. You have to come up with an estimate of what is possible. You have to foresee the catastrophes which are awaiting you, and so forth and so on. So you have to start from the future. And generally that means you've got to think at least a decade or 2 decades ahead. That's what it takes to get any major change in technology through in any nation. So therefore you start from the future. Now this is a peculiarity of the human mind which does not exist in the animal mind. The animal mind can only work on the basis of working from the present to the future. The human mind, when it's functioning, works from the future to begin with the present. And that's the difference. So it's a way of thinking that's important. Because there's a way of thinking of the animal, which is what most people do when they talk about forecasting. They will project from the present into the future, but from the present. They will determine what they can do from the present. The scientist, who is competent, works from what he can do from the future to the present. And the difference between the two for a human being is credit. And what happened? Kennedy started a space program. How does the space program work? How does it continue to work? The space program operates only on the basis of proceeding from the future goal to the present achievement. You get to Mars, or you get to the moon first. Now, we didn't finish that job, but the intention was to finish it. And the intention has been that the way you can live on the moon, under any condition, you're going to go underground. You're going to be an underground movement on the moon. Because all this garbage keeps coming down on the surface of the moon, and it's not a good place to play. So you have to take these tunnels that you can get in the moon, and you put your apparatus in your system inside these tunnels, and hope that you've got them down deep enough so that you're going to resist any of the kinds of things you expect might hit on the surface. So you will plan, first of all, to build a myriad on the moon in tunnels. And there you will begin to build up largely with some human participation, because it's sort of a short hop to the moon if you've got good systems. But the point is, you're going to have to build up a complete apparatus in the tunnels of the moon. And this is going to be the way you're going to build economically the kinds of devices that will go to places in space among the asteroids and things like that out there. And that's the way you're going to do it. You must start from planning from the future to the present. Now, I did a little thing like that on the Woman on Mars. It was exactly just a kick in the butt for some people who are too lazy about getting on the horse on this one. But that's the way it works. You have to plan for a point in the future where something is going to happen. You will then work your way backward from the future to see if you can do every step on the way to that point. And so therefore what we want is we want to get young people out of the dumps, out of the drug yards and similar places, and get them into technological training and university training of good quality. A good quality means it starts from the future. You take the most advanced conceptions in physical science, or an approach to physical science. You take the most advantageous standpoint. You define that, cross-check it, think about it. Now you figure out how you can work your way back to reaching the point that you want to get to from where you are today. And that's the only way this will work. That's the way I work. It's the way I forecast. Any human being can forecast effectively if they go through the kind of training and concessions to what they should know that's required. If you're starting from today to build your way to a future, you're going to find yourself sliding backwards more than going forward. So what we need is we need to get people who have competence and imagination to match, who will pick points in the future which are achievable. And first of all, you start with things that you can know will work. Something will work 5 years from now, or over a period of 5 years, or over 10 years, or something like that. And you take that, but I would say we have to take 2 generations, 50 years. And the general perspective should be programs which are based on a 50-year perspective, with increments in between. And you won't finish it up that way, but you will start doing it that way because you will have given yourself a task, and your experience in trying to accomplish that task, even in the planning phase, will build up your competence, and you probably get pretty close to what you thought you could do.
Good. Okay, Lynn, I have a follow-up question along the same lines, which is the stupidity around this fiscal cliff. So we know the 112th Congress kicked the can down the road, so to speak, to the 113th on this, and postponed the whole voting on the fiscal cliff for a couple of months, which can coincide with the debt ceiling. And what you referenced earlier in what you said in your opening remarks, with this built-in threat to humanity around the thinking around the green policy, and this has been indoctrinated into the culture, into the schools, and I would say that the same holds with this idea of monetarism as well. And as the debate comes up with the fiscal cliff and whatnot, the problem is that you have this idea of practicality that, well, we hate to make these cuts, but it has to be done in order to try and solve the economic problem, which is really a problem number one, in thinking, but it's also the wrong fight, because we are on the verge of a hyperinflationary breakout throughout the transatlantic community as a whole, which requires Glass-Steagall. So if you could speak to this problem in the thinking around monetarism in this whole debate, the fallacy of it.
Well, the problem is largely entirely fictitious. What Bernanke is doing has to be written off, because there's no payment for it. There's never a repayment. So how can you build up debt upon debt when it can never be repaid? What value has a debt that can never be repaid, and that will only kill the people who try to use it? Most of Wall Street, practically the entire Wall Street and similar kinds of institutions across the transatlantic region in particular, are hopelessly bankrupt. Now, what happens in a bankruptcy when you try to eliminate a bankruptcy? What you have to do is learn what you're going to write off. I can tell you that most of what Bernanke represents in his hyperinflationary game will have to be written off. If you don't write it off, it will write you off. You have to choose between what's going to get written off, you or this play money, which is being put up by Bernanke. This is a fraud. It is not an honest obligation. When institutions of government, through the power they have, impose upon a nation a debt which is fraudulent, do you pay it? Are you kind enough not to imprison the people who you punish for that? Now, if you don't accept that, you're dead.
Okay. I'd like to switch gears a little bit to bring this question of a thermonuclear war on the table. Over the New Year's, there were a lot of different coordinated bombings in Iraq, largely Sunni and Shiite religious kind of violence, and especially in the period since our intervention into Libya, we've had an increase throughout the region of a lot of different kinds of religious violence, which we did not see before, which, you know, you had a relative peace amongst the religions in the region, and our role there has been essentially the British role of creating this environment of destabilization in general. Now, adding to this, you have the Russians and the Iranians have been doing different naval exercises. The Congress here in the United States has decided to send a couple of naval frigates over there, guided missile frigates, which are older, but it's still just adding a bunch of fuel on this, on this fire as a region. So we do have, Walter Jones did reintroduce his, what was HCR 107, which is now HCR 3, which says that if the president goes to war without Congress, he becomes immediately impeachable. So there is that on the table. We've put out our fact sheet, and this is gaining legs in terms of getting Obama out of there. But if you could speak to this war threat and doing something about it, that'd be helpful.
Yes, I can speak to this war threat. I'm an old acquaintance of war threats. Been around for some time on this sort of thing. The point is, what's the threat? It is not a threat from the Middle East. It's not a threat from North Africa. It's not really much of a threat from Asia. Where's it a threat from? From the transatlantic region of the United States, Britain, and Western Europe. That's where the danger comes from. There are other proximate areas of such infection. But the accession thing is between the government of the United States and the government of the British Empire, not Britain, the British Empire. And the British Empire includes Saudi Arabia as an integral part of the British Empire. For example, let's take a concrete case. These formulas sometimes about what the problem is and how do you solve the formula. I don't think that solving the formula necessarily solves the problem. It may solve somebody's desire to feel good, but it doesn't do much good for mankind. So you still have a relic of the Roman Empire. And by the Roman Empire, I mean, first of all, the Roman Empire itself, then what you had in the more modern Greece, following that, what you had with the Venetian system, the old Venetian system. Then you had the new Venetian system, which came up in the 17th century. And then out of the new Venetian system, which opened its attack directly upon Northern Europe and Europe as a whole by an attack on France. So it was the so-called Dutch attack, including Descartes. Descartes was a key part of this thing. That filthy pig, Descartes. Anyway. But anyway, so that after doing that, after this operation against France, the first operation against France, then what happened is that William of Orange, who was a key leader of this operation, the new Venetian party, invaded Britain and Ireland. And out of this process came a process in the early part of the 18th century, which established the British Empire before Britain itself became part of it. So then you had in the attack on the United States, or what was to become the United States, the war with the United States, became the next step. And the Napoleonic Wars then became the vehicle by which the Venetian, or the Venice system, or rather set up the replacement for France in this operation. And this established a British Empire. Now, the British Empire has gone through a number of phases of development since that time. But the British Empire today, which rules over all of Africa by various devices, which rules over most of this area which is endangered now in the east, in the nearby Asia, near Asia, and which exists in other places. So what you have out there is you have a British Empire, which is not based on what people think an empire is, some clunking old crown is out there with his staff or something. No, it's a system. Typical of the system is Tony Blair. Now, Tony Blair is the controller of our current president. He's the one that ushered our current president into his position as president in the United States. He's the one that launched the second war against Iraq, second Iraq War, which was a fraud. And what Tony Blair has done, and in his reign up to this point, has been the chief agent of the British monarchy in terms of its rule over most of the planet. Now, obviously, the solution should be self-evident. Break it up. And if the United States has a presidency and a Congress which says, get rid of it, it will go, because all of Europe is bankrupt, especially Western and Central Europe. They haven't got a prayer unless this is done. What we had in this thing we referred to in the Post, the same thing. Unless you clean that mess up, you have to bankrupt the whole system. Why do you bankrupt it? Because you don't do something dirty to it? No, because it's worthless. You take the worthless currency, the worthless claims, and say, we're not going to pay these worthless claims. We're not going to play these lies and pay them off. And so the idea that we have problems in various parts of the world, we don't have problems in various parts of the world. We have a problem in the world. And part of the problem in the world is the stinking presidents we've had of late. George Bush Jr., what a jerk. But he was only an excuse for what we did to the United States. This jerk is menace, is evil, brought in. We don't even know what his birthplace was. We don't know what his citizenship is. We don't have no proof that we can count on that he's actually a citizen. He's probably not qualified to be president. There was a mistake. We may have to change. But the point is, we have to decide. The planet is on the verge of thermonuclear war. It's getting closer all the time because it's built into the system. We have to change the system. You cannot, in other words, you cannot negotiate with this war threat of thermonuclear war. You have to change the system. You cannot dictate terms within the system. You have to change the system. And to change the system is simple. If Russia, China, and the United States happen to agree with that purpose, it will happen. We need a President of the United States and a Congress of the United States which are true patriots, not people kissing the butt of the British Queen. We don't mind the people of Great Britain, the United Kingdom. We wish the best for them in the form of Glass-Steagall and things like that. Let them choose that. It's good. We want good for people. This is not simply a national problem. It's a global problem. because what we're dealing with is a British Empire, which is an extension of the new Venetian party, which controls most of the planet. And this guy, Blair, should be given a visa for a permanent visit to the moon.
Well, on the subject of changing the system, I thought I'd ask you about a discussion we had a little bit earlier in this week about a couple of revolutionaries, Max Planck and Albert Einstein, who we discussed on Wednesday, who certainly completely changed the system of physics to their time. Planck, the father of the quantum, and then Einstein, who created so many things, including relativity. Now, in that discussion, we'd discussed the difference between legalism or literalism versus morality and creativity. And I wanted to read a short quote from a reaction that you had to that discussion, that you said, "The crucial fact of the discussion turned out to be the beacon of truth in classical art and a morality of science, which are shared, in a most essential way, by the circles of Max Planck and Albert Einstein. Their morality respecting classical artistic composition and their physical science bring forth in practice the standards of truth on which actual morality expressed in the name of science must be upheld as the very foundations of any competent notion of physical science. Competent science is that which is consistent with the concurrence of morality in science and the topical features of that edition of the weekly report." Now, here's what I'd like to ask you, because you just brought up towards the end of your last question the whether Obama is actually a natural-born citizen, whether he's even allowed to become the president. An email question had come in. It's come in a number of times to the website, asking about whether it would be useful to pursue various legal means of like sending letters to Eric Holder, insisting that Holder not allow Obama to become reinaugurated, which obviously the odds of that are pretty slim. But it sort of brought up this distinction between hoping to change history by writing letters in an armchair, as opposed to the kind of work that we did on Capitol Hill, the work that you do by constantly intervening into the political system. The difference between doing something that's shocking and new and unexpected and creative, and then hoping to move things forward by finding a place in a system that already exists. So that might be somewhat confusing, but I would like to hear your thoughts on what that type of morality is.
Well, first of all, you have to ask what's creativity. And if you look at what we have in terms of policy, what you have a degeneration. And the way I look at this thing, it's the most efficient way to look at it because it avoids some complications, and if you look at the complications, you say they're not worth worrying over at this point. So you have the beginning of the Renaissance. And the beginning of the Renaissance creates a new period in history. It's a fundamentally new period in history from a long period of times. And this was Nicholas Acusa. And Nicholas Acusa was the actual author of this concept. His most crucial follower was, guess whom? Was exactly the development of our whole system, planetary system. Yeah, Kepler. Oh. So Kepler typifies as the true, shall we say, descendant or apostle of Kepler, of Acusa. Now, what came out of that was actually an understanding that sense perception as such is not reality. It is a shadow cast by reality, not reality as such. We have confidence because we are dependent upon our senses to treat that experience as if it were the reality. But when you look at the function of creativity in terms of the human mind, you find that no animal has that capability of creativity. That is, mankind actually discusses, and Kepler's the perfect example of it. Cusa's the perfect example of it. All of the history of mankind and of classical art are not based on sense perception. They involve sense perception, but they control it. They are not controlled by it. The person who's controlled by their senses is an idiot, or worse. The person who uses sense perception as an instrument controlled by an intention is the difference. Now, this is typical in classical music, since Bach in particular, but it was already the same principle back in the time of Cusa. Just at the development of the great, some of the great constructions there at that time. So the issue here is the identity of mankind is not to be based on sense perception. Sense perception is something we use, but we don't necessarily believe in it as, shall we say, gospel. Is the footprint of reality, not the foot. And therefore, the important thing is to utilize what we call creativity. Creativity is expressed, among other things, in classical musical composition, which is a very good term of reference to use in discussing this matter. You take the history of music, take it from the time of Cusa, his lifetime, where it was already significant. You go along with the development, which leads into Bach. The Bach revolution changes everything, for the people who understood it and enjoyed it, and the greatest musicians. Then you get a development, which starts with Franz Liszt, the unfortunate poor boy, as Beethoven referred to him. And this guy is no musician. He's a clown. He has no capability of actual creativity. He has the ability of innovation, not creativity. Bach represents creativity, not mere innovation. And all the greatest musicians, composers, who were the followers of Bach, they were also followers of earlier adventures, but Bach defined something unique, as with his preludes and fugues. This gave us a discipline which exploded everything. It exploded everything in terms of musical art. Then came, what? The reaction. The reaction which was led by the British and by others, the Austrians. And so they turned an attack against classical musical composition and its performance. And this gave birth to Liszt, Wagner, and so forth. And then to the 20th century clowns, who were not musicians at all, but noisemakers. And so the point is that what we represent in terms of creativity, actual scientific creativity, and the form of creativity, which is a form also of scientific creativity, which is classical musical composition. All great classical art is for example, take the case of a great classical drama, a known one, say Shakespeare, or someone in that same realm. And if you find there's something about that which does not exist in modern art, and particularly in 20th century and drama. What's proves in the 20th century tends toward garbage. There was still some residue at the beginning of the 20th century. But after that, the decay was obvious. And after the end of World War II, it was clear. From 1950 on, all art was condemned to become either crazy, degenerate, or shut down. And practically all of the art since that time, except some people who are throwbacks to the earlier period, and usually are failures because they are throwbacks. They're not popular. So popular music, popular entertainment, all these kinds of things represent a form of degeneracy. Now, this runs into another fact, that in the physical universe, the principles which operate in the physical universe do not conform to sense perception. And you take the case of Max Planck, and of Einstein. And what's the difference? They didn't believe in any of that crap. This all came from Bertrand Russell and company, and similar kinds of the Austrian school and so forth. Degeneracy. So what's happened, we've come from a period in which we're in the beginning of with Cusa, which is part of this whole process of the Renaissance. You had a progress of mankind through ebbs and flows, but consistently revivals as well as the terrible things that happened in between. This process had a certain genesis, which corresponded to the American Revolution, to the American settlement, as in Massachusetts. The Massachusetts settlement, in its time, was more advanced in technology than Britain. And this was what Franklin represented. So you have these ebbs and flows in terms of creativity and culture. But with the process which happened after the killing of presidents, we come into a period. Roosevelt's one of the last great presidents. John F. Kennedy was potentially one of the great presidents and was a great president in his own time. What do you have after that? Garbage. So what's going on? You have some people who think in a way which leads to human creativity as manifest physically in physical creations, and you have another thing which is garbage dump, which is popular opinion. What that teaches you is that everything that mankind has accomplished is in violation of tradition, of simple animal-like traditions. And thus, the whole purpose of life is to make further that. Because if you cannot continue the process of creativity, as typified by, for example, the example of Cusa and Kepler, perfect example, or classical drama, Shakespeare. Now, what do you get in Shakespeare? Do you see on a Shakespeare drama, which is competently done, which is rare enough these days, do you see the actor on stage? No, you don't see the actor on stage. Not if it's a good drama. You see a reality which is not located within the actor on stage, within the events that you see on stage, as in the case of Henry V, the long introductions. It's in the imagination. So which is real? Is the imagination real, or is the sensual experience real? Which is true? Which is truer? And the same thing applies in classical music. What mankind is, the soul of mankind does not lie in the flesh. It lies in the imagination. And the imagination is the force of creativity by which man, through science and through scientific discovery, promoted in that way, is able to transform man's relationship to the universe we inhabit. The reality lies not in sense perception, the experience of sense perception. It lies in what we can do with the powers of mind, the creative powers of mind, to change the universe we inhabit in some significant degree. And the best example of that, the naked example of that, is classical drama, typified by Shakespeare and by great poetry. Because the classical drama brings forth the real human person, whereas the alternative muffles it.
Well, I thank you for that, and I think that's a beautiful conclusion to our broadcast tonight. Thank you, everybody, for watching, and I'd also like to thank Dennis and Jason for joining us. Be sure to tune in regularly every Friday night, as well as on Mondays and Wednesdays for our other regular broadcasts on LaRouchePack.com, and we have a lot of work to do over the coming days. So thank you, and good night.